Hey everyone, in this video I will go over Limit Break in FF14 and try to explain every little detail you've ever wanted to know about it. We've also released an infographic about the topic, summarizing the important parts. It will be linked in the description, so check it out afterwards if you haven't seen it yet. Let's start with the basics. In FF14, Limit Break is an action that every combat job except Blue Mage has access to. The effect depends on the role of the user's job. A DPS job will deal lots of damage, a healer will heal the party, and a tank will mitigate damage. Each DPS role has a different type of limit break. Minis deal a high amount of single target damage, casters deal damage to every target in a circular AoE, and physical ranged deal damage to every target in a line AoE. All of these have their own advantages, and the best LB to use heavily depends on the situation. You can find the Limit Break action in your Actions and Traits window listed under General. In order to use Limit Break, the limit gauge has to be filled. Let's talk about that. The limit gauge becomes available as soon as you're in a party of at least 4 people. It will slowly fill over time during combat. We will get into the details about that later. When you're in a full party, meaning 8 people, the limit gauge extends to have another segment. When you're fighting the last boss in a dungeon, trial or raid, the gauge extends another segment. This means that in a 4-player party you can have a maximum of 2 segments, and in a full party you can have up to 3 segments. Since there are only a few 8-player dungeons, it means you'll almost always have access to all 3 segments when you're doing 8-player duties. The limit gauge is a shared party resource, meaning that once anyone uses Limit Break, the gauge will reset for everyone. And the effect that is triggered depends on how many segments were completely filled. Any incomplete segments will be wasted. A generating limit break falls into 2 categories, active and passive generation. Passive generation occurs on every server tick while you're in combat, so every 3 seconds. The generated amount depends on the amount of available segments and can be lowered by having non-standard party setups, which will incur penalties. The party can have up to 5 penalties, and each penalty will decrease the generation speed by a certain amount. So what is a penalty and how do you avoid them? When you're playing with a non-standard party composition, for example 1 healer, 2 tanks and 5 DPS, you will incur 1 penalty. The same applies if you're solo tanking, and they stack, so a 1 healer, 1 tank and 6 DPS party would have 2 penalties. Another way to incur penalties is by having duplicate jobs in the party. However, this only applies in high-end duties. Currently, this would be Leviathan Unreal, the last tier of Savage raids and all the ultimate raids. And let's take a standard 8-player party as an example and set this as our reference point. If the party has 1 penalty, LB generation will be at around 77% of its normal speed. 2 penalties would reduce it to 73%, 3 penalties to 70%, 4 penalties to 65%, and 5 or more penalties would reduce it to 63%. And the amount of available segments also affects how quickly LB is generated. You might have noticed that when you were in combat with the last boss of a dungeon. You usually get a complete segment in less than 3 minutes there, because the passive generation in that case is a lot higher than when you only have 1 segment available. And now let's talk about active generation. There are 5 things that can fill the LB gauge actively. Critical health recovery, surviving lethal damage, interrupts and silences, killing ads, and resolving mechanics. Critical health recovery occurs when a player who is at or below 10% of their maximum HP receives a direct heal. Surviving lethal damage means that a player survives a hit that would have normally killed them through the use of damage mitigation abilities or shields. One thing to note here is that debuffs like Addle and Feint do not count as mitigation in this case. Interrupts and silences award a certain amount of limit gauge in some duties. This is quite rare and very encounter specific. Killing adds is another encounter-specific mechanic. A recent example from Shadowbringers would be Seed of Sacrifice Extreme, where killing 2 adds awards a full limit gauge. Resolving mechanics is also specific to certain encounters. Examples would be Omega 3 and 11 Savage. The values of active generation differ heavily between pre-Shadowbringers and post-Shadowbringers content. Yet generally, active generation is much higher in pre-Shadowbringers content, and this knowledge can be used to your advantage in the Stormblood Ultimate raids. Here's an example of our Uwu clear, where we use a lot of mitigation and get hit by Ifrit's Crimson Cyclone on purpose to generate LB. So, what affects Limit Breaks damage? You might have heard that the damage is calculated based on the average item level of the party members. And while this isn't completely false, there is a bit more to it that you should know. Here's my bard with an average item level of 524. LB1 deals around 120k damage to the dummy. Now, let's do the same with an average item level of 79. You would think that the damage would be a lot lower, but as you can see, it stays the same. This is because the damage of Limit Break is determined by the average item level of the main hand weapons of the group. The other slots don't matter at all. Here's the same test again with my full gear, only changing the weapon to a lower item level piece. As you can see, the damage is reduced dramatically. Another important thing to note is that the damage is completely unaffected by damage buffs or debuffs on yourself. Here's the same setup with Raging Strikes, which should increase the damage by 10%. This also means that damage reducing effects on the player, such as the weakness debuff, do not affect it either. However, damage mitigating effects on bosses will reduce the limit break damage, so you can't use it to cheese immunities or similar things. As with all kinds of damage effects in the game, there is a random 5% variance in damage, which means you won't always deal exactly the same damage. There can be low and high rolls. We can't compare the absolute damage numbers, but we can compare the relative numbers. Let's take melee LB1 as our reference point. This will be what we consider 100% damage. In that case, a caster's LB1 would deal 60% damage to every target in the AoE, and a physical ranged LB1 would deal 54% damage to every target. What we can conclude from this is that as soon as there are 2 targets, using a caster or physical ranged LB would be more efficient than using a melee limit break on a boss. However, to fairly compare these, you also need to factor in the cast time and animation lock afterwards. In endgame raids, you might find yourself in a situation where you will gain 4 LB segments throughout the fight, and most people will choose to use these on a melee LB3 and a melee LB1 afterwards. This would result in a total of 450% damage with a cast and animation time of 14 seconds. However, what I personally recommend is using 2 melee LB2s instead. This would result in a total of 440% damage with a cast and animation time of 12.7 seconds. In my opinion, it's definitely worth giving up a little damage in order to give the LB user more freedom to adjust to mechanics and their rotation. Also, when you're doing dungeons and you have a caster or physical ranged in the party, it is always better to let them use it on normal pulls, rather than having a melee use it on bosses. It is very rare that tank and healer limit breaks get used since they are so situational. Healer LB1 and 2 are basically useless. They only heal the party for 25% and 60% of their HP respectively. Some sources say that it also regenerates MP, but that is not true. Since using LB puts you into animation lock, I would not consider using these under any circumstances, except when there's really no other option. Healer LB3, however, is very useful since it raises and fully heals everyone within range. This is extremely useful in 8-player duties where you can save runs that would otherwise be over. A nice bonus is that it raises people without the weakness debuff. Let's talk about Tank LB. It reduces the whole party's damage taken by 20% for 10 seconds, 40% for 12 seconds and 80% for 8 seconds respectively. Certain fights require Tank LB3 to be used to survive a mechanic. A recent example from Shadowbringers would be Seed of Sacrifice. However, LB1 and 2 also have their niche uses. Personally, I really enjoyed using LB2 at the end of the last Eden Savage fight, mitigating lots of AoE damage. However, in most cases, you should not use tank LBs unless it is absolutely required to survive. A nice thing about it is that it doesn't have a cast time, which means the damage reducing effect will apply as soon as you hit the button. If you made it this far, thanks a lot for watching. I hope I was able to present this complex topic in an easily digestible way without getting too technical. Let me know in the comments if any questions remain unanswered and I'll be happy to reply to you. This information was gathered by Fürst Blumir for Elegant Studies, so huge shout out to them. I will link their Google Doc in the description below. And of course I'd like to thank all of our patrons. The names of those who are in the $5 tier and above are listed here.